Service. It's an idea that we are well accustomed to in the 21st century. Ideas of nation, pride, dedication to duty, these are all intrinsic to why we believe that people fight. So baked in are these ideals, which frankly have their rise across the 19th century, that the term mercenary has become something of a dirty word. But in the 18th century, being a mercenary was much closer to the norm. In an age where people fought for different reasons and had a much more transactional approach to service, who therefore were the men who signed up to fight in the 18th century? Tonight, our series on the wars that led to the Napoleonic Wars makes a welcome return as Alex Burns and Andrew Dorman help us to unpick the social fabric of those who went to fight in the 18th century. We discussed the conditions that they worked in, whether the scum of the earth comment was ever apt at any point in the history of warfare, and why there was so much lace when it came to what these guys wore. This is the Mercenaries' Tale, the 18th century way of war. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where frankly I am just delighted that that intro worked as well as it did, because I did not expect that to run off the tongue when I embarked on that first take. As you've heard, we are looking at the fabric of why people were fighting and who was fighting during the 18th century as part of our efforts to understand the wars that led to the Napoleonic Wars. Liam Telfer is once again in the house. The quartermaster has returned, but this time I am quite relieved that he is not in the physical house because he is somewhat germ-infused. You have my commiserations, mate. We will spare the listeners the gory details, but we will blame it entirely on your daughter and her insistence on exploring avidly whether or not unicorns exist with all of her many friends from many corners of the realm. Besides from your sniffles, how are you doing?
And well, I really liked how you said my name almost with an up pitch at the end, as if am I really here? But I know I'm very well, thank you, mate. And I'm really excited to dive into what I guess is sort of part two in the 18th century with these guys. Tonight, we are joined, as Zach said in the intro, by Dr. Alexander Burns. He's an assistant professor of history at the Franciscan University of Steubenville. Alex studies North America and military Europe in the 18th century. His doctoral dissertation was entitled The Entire Army Says Hello, Common Soldiers Experiences Localism and Army Reform in Britain and Prussia, 1739 to 1789. And his next book, Infantry in Battle, 1733 to 1783, will hopefully appear this year and is published through Hellion. Also in the box in the room on the screen with us tonight is Dr. Andrew Dorman, PhD from Dublin City University, and is in the process of converting his doctoral dissertation into a book that will be published as part of Boydell and Brewer's Irish Historical Monographs. That's a series, by the way, and hopefully that'll be out in 2025. How are we, gentlemen?
Wonderful. It's great to be back on the pod.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be back. Nice to be bringing more 18th century stuff to the masses. I presume our listenership can be classified as masses at this stage after episode
Absolutely.
one.
I mean, at least 5 people listen to this show, so it's all in how you choose to market it, right?
A critical mass, then.
There we go. Perfect. The people who really matter listen to this show. That's the way I'll sell it. That'll keep the punters on side for sure. Yeah, actually, before we dive in, I just want to say congrats to both of you over your contracts. I don't think we actually mentioned that last time. As somebody who fails abjectly to follow in your footsteps in terms of securing that contract and getting the damn book written, hats off to you, or rather, if I was wearing a hat, I would take it off in respect to you. But I'm greatly looking forward to both of your work, both of your works, if that's the right terminology, being published. And I suspect we might actually take full advantage to sit down and talk to you one to one when that does in fact happen, because so much of what you guys look at feeds into ultimately the world that people like myself and Liam get to inhabit in the course of this show. Um, and where to start with this? I'm going to start with questioning my own introduction. So I've sold everybody a story of mercenary, a mercenary, a fundamentally transactional approach to service being much more widespread during this period. We talk a lot about sort of conscription of the Grand Armées and the levée en masse and all the rest of it. But have I overstated it in my introduction? Granted, I might have sort of slightly set it up in such a way to enable us to deconstruct it and say, well, maybe we're not kind of approaching this in quite the same way. But is it fair to think of these armies as at least substantially made up of mercenaries? And I suppose where, if we dare take this back even further, so the risk of kind of dragging us all the way back into what is definitely the wrong century, when it comes to the 17th century, where does this crossover happen in terms of mercenary? And when we go from things like retinues and all the rest of it into something sort of that we might be more familiar with when it comes to sort of colonels raising their regiments and all the rest of it. And then obviously on into what we know from the Napoleonic Wars of king's regiments and colonels' influence dwindling. This is a very waffly way of saying, A, have I got it right to emphasize the mercenary thing? But also B, let's flesh out the picture. You know, what's the incentive for these guys? There's a lot to unpack there. Just a little bit. Like, welcome to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we don't ask simple questions ever. Alex, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll think I'll let Andrew probably talk mostly about Britain. But just kind of taking us on a survey of what Christopher Duffy called military Europe, it kind of depends where you are, whether or not mercenary is a helpful term for these troops. Certainly, the further east you go, it looks a little less mercenary. So states like Russia, all the way on from the early part of the 18th century, from about 1705, they're recruiting via conscription. And this is not like the levée en masse in terms of the scale of it, sort of calculated draws on population. In some ways, they're taking this from an earlier 17th century idea of conscription that came out of the Swedish army in the period of the 30 Years' War, the Indelningsverket. Probably the most famous army of the 18th century, at least in my opinion, as someone who writes a bit about Prussia, is the Prussian army of Frederick II or Frederick the Great. It's kind of half and half there, depending on what year we're talking about. And you know, maybe if we look at the 7 Years' War, at the beginning of that war, it's probably 40% troops that are sort of volunteering for that army, compared to about 60% that have been conscripted from the local Prussian population. Those local Prussian troops, or cantonists, as they're often called, because they're divided into recruiting districts or canton districts. They look a lot less like mercenaries than the variety of Frenchmen and Italians and even a few English speakers that are in the Prussian army in the early 18th century, who are there essentially looking for a job. And so kind of distinguishing between those forces. And this won't make me many friends in my home country of the United States, but a lot of the soldiers that Washington fights with in the War of Independence are conscripted. They're especially from states like New Jersey, especially the later you get in that conflict, New Jersey, Pennsylvania are using like a lottery draft system in order to fill out the ranks. Because after 1775 and after 1776, it turns out beating the British Army is actually quite difficult and not many people want to do it. And so as a result, we kind of draw on a draft system in order to fill out the ranks of the Continental Army to keep the war going. So again, mercenaries, yes, absolutely, they exist. Even transnational mercenaries, maybe in the way that we would think about it today. Um, Something that I wrestle with a little bit, in my dissertation, and beyond is, how much do we think of people who are volunteering to fight for pay in their own state's military as a mercenary in the 18th century? There's a lot of that going on. Certainly, they are being paid to fight. They don't have to be there. Does that make them a mercenary? It's a good question.
So many directions I immediately want to go in that would actually take us away from letting Dorman have a say. So I'm going to mute myself at this point, let Andy have a say, and then we might discuss the 4 follow-up areas of discussion that I've already identified in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think Alex touched on something there that's worth highlighting, that the very word soldier has a monetary element to it. It comes from soldier's wage that was given. So this whole mercenary culture is kind of ingrained into it from its inception. Um, I also like that you've given the Irishman the role of talking about Britain. I'll try and not be biased, but
What could
um,
possibly go wrong, right?
they were all bastards. No, I'll be more professional than that. Um, from a British perspective, and I actually think the Irish perspective is quite interesting in this century because we, along with the Swiss and arguably some German states as well, there is quite a strong mercenary culture fighting for whoever would pay. Um, and that is dynastic. So there's this culture of honor there to consider too, but it's also convenience. In the Irish example, it's difficult to get a job in the British Army, particularly if you're a Catholic. It's more easy and you're more wanted in the French service. But once Catholics become more acceptable in the British service, they flock there. So convenience and accessibility is a great motivator, I think, to enlist in the army proper. And I think the British Army in this century is, strictly speaking, a volunteer force. However, are you volunteering if one is made drunk by a recruiting sergeant down in a pub and then you sign the contract and wake up the following day and you realize, oh, wait, I'm in the army? Now, there's some examples of that dotted throughout memoirs, but we don't know how widespread that practice is. But I think that is an important element to consider. These are, in the most part, people who have signed up, and this isn't really as you described in the 30 Years' War. I was really excited. I thought we were going to get onto a discussion of military revolution and Jeffrey Parker for a second there, but thankfully he skewed us away. Um, but I think that you know th this is a different force to what has come before, but one can still see that those t soldier tendrils tracing their way back.
I must admit, mercenary is a term that I I've had to start thinking about much more. I'm sorry to make it about sort of my elements of research to sort of bring those into this, but when you're dealing with the East India Company, like it gets really very complicated because these guys aren't serving a nation. They are a private army. It's a company. They are absolutely mercenaries, and you've got to divide within that quite obviously between the Europeans who join the East India Company army and then the sepoys who are recruited and what motivates them. And I think because of the more modern way in which we talk about mercenaries, which I often sort of encounter having quite a sort of negative connotation, I just it's not as though it's a derogatory term, but I just have a little bit of an issue with it. And where I'm going with this is to effectively try and track back with that term mercenary, bearing in mind that soldiers across history until relatively recently have not been regarded with reverence and have been sort of black sheep of families and sort of the sort of people that you don't want your daughter associating with, for example. And I guess what I'm asking is where can we identify that kind of resistance to the idea of a mercenary? Is it always there in the sense that people identify soldiers as people who are tasked with being violent for money, and therefore they have some kind of problem with that? And then all of this gets sort of obscured when we start to talk about reasons why people serve a country. Then we bring in sort of remembrance and commemoration and respect and all the rest of it. And then mercenary sort of reemerges as somebody who doesn't adhere to those principles. I'm kind of losing my own sort of train of thought because I'm wrestling with these ideas as we go. But I don't know if there's anything in that. Maybe this is a question that we need to cut, quite frankly, from the final edit. But do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Sure. So when we think about mercenaries, especially as I'm an American, the test case that always comes in is what we call the Hessians, right? Who come and fight in the American War of Independence, and particularly that case gets at some of the complexities of loyalty and what does it mean to be a soldier in the 18th century? Are you a mercenary? So in the 1760s, at the end of the Seven Years' War, where the Hessians also fought alongside the British against the French, there's actually a lot of political and dynastic connections between these various states. I mean, there's 6 states that send troops to go fight against George Washington and company alongside the Redcoats in the Revolutionary War. These troops from Hessen-Kassel specifically are conscripted into the army. They're not mercenaries on a personal level. They're men from Hessen who've been conscripted by state law into the regimented military of their country, of their state, and are then sent to fight in North America. So that you almost have this weird moment where you have both conscripts who are also what we call mercenaries, right? And what's happening here is the Germans actually have a term for this. They call it the Soldatenhandel, or the trade in soldiers. It's actually the state that is the mercenary entity, not the individual. And so when we think about the term mercenary in the 18th century, frequently Americans, if they think about the Hessians at all, which I think I probably overestimate how much they do, they call the Hessians mercenaries. And it might be possible that you would call the Hessian prince a mercenary state ruler or something like this. But calling these individual soldiers mercenaries is not terribly accurate. They've been conscripted to fight into their state's military. It's just that their government has made a subsidy agreement with Great Britain to go and fight in the Revolutionary War. There are other states who consider this type of arrangement. If you trend away from that state mercenary, just look at the personal level, and as Andrew suggested, there are a lot of folks who are maybe specialized in this regard in the 18th century, the Swiss particularly. But I think in some ways, a lot of who we would think of as a mercenary in the 18th century, most of these soldiers who are fighting for their own country. The relative number of men who cross state borders to fight in an army that's speaking a different language from the native language they fluently speak is very rare. It's actually more common in the officer class than it is the enlisted men. Now, in a state like Prussia, where you desperately need a large army, it's higher than normal. Obviously, there are regiments of the regular French army and other state militaries that specialize in having troops that maybe are non-native and are kind of drawing them toward that way. But as Andrew Bamford reminded us at the 7 Years' War Convention in South Bend last year, even by the time you get to the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, there were a worrying number of Frenchmen in the Irish Brigade. And so a lot of these, by the time you get into the middle of the 18th century, as we're kind of moving towards the Napoleonic Wars, these armies are starting to look a little bit more national, in a way that Maybe again, this is one of the great themes of my scholarly career. Is maybe it's a bit more like a transition to the Napoleonic Wars than a radical overnight break where something new happens.
Yeah, I think I'd like to echo a particular point there that the officer class is where you see this sort of movement around, and they got around. And as the century progresses, perhaps, and I think we're going to talk later on about the concept of nation, perhaps you do get more of an identity. But in the early conflicts, War of the Spanish Succession, War of the Austrian Succession, it was a job. It really, you could happily move around. And I mean, you get Irishmen fighting in Russia, Sweden, France, Holy Roman Empire, and its various polities, often against each other in the officer class. The idea of a homogeneous regiment, and as mentioned, these become quite dilute as the century wears on. I think we're hovering around 33% Irish around the around Fontenoy, which is supposed to be the big Irish victory. Um, but nonetheless, the homogeneous regiment is less common, um, and it becomes less common as the century goes forward. But the officers really, you do see them scattered throughout, and I think perhaps one of the reasons why we know more about the officer class is because they had this network and they wrote more, that naturally, and as by extension, uh, they're a little bit easier to access.
I've been given the hurry up by the quartermaster who is communicating with me as because what you guys perhaps aren't familiar with is we have a running kind of planning session as we record these episodes, and so I have like 4 or 5 additional areas of follow up. I'm like implications on how wars wage, martial race theory, Hessians, convenience, like all of these things that you're talking about. I'm like, okay, we need to talk more about that and that and that. And the quartermaster has looked at me and gone, stop it. I can see what you're doing. But I'm going to rebel just on one point, even though Andrew has set us up a very nice little segue there into what was meant to be the next question. Because there was something that Alex said that caught my interest. You were talking about how fundamentally Washington's forces in the latter part of the American War of Independence slash Revolution were conscript, and you said this won't make me particularly popular with my compatriots. I would like to dig into that and just kind of get a sense of, because I love a myth bust on this show. Like, what is the common perception? Where does that come from? And why is it so contentious?
Sure. So the common perception of the American army that Americans really love to think about is the American army in 1775 and 1776, which is essentially the creation of what some historians call like the military rage, where Americans love to think about this. Just a bunch of angry Americans show up with guns and start shooting at the British at Lexington and Concord, right? There's not really a formal army. There's not really a great, huge power structure. We just show up and start fighting. That's the America that really I think people envision when they think about the Revolutionary War. But that goes away vanishingly quickly. I mean, you can't fight a war without logistics. You can't fight a war without unity of command. And so, as a result, this army that kind of comes out of nothing is very quickly regimented into an army that exists within the context of military Europe. Washington is trying to make his army look more and more European consistently throughout the Revolutionary War. To some extent, and you can even see this in the writings that survive. All the literate middle class men who are patriotically motivated and sign up to fight in 1775, they're out of the army by the end of 1776. And so as you move on into the later part of the Revolutionary War, you're getting men who are poor, you're getting men who are volunteering and essentially not quite bounty jumping, but taking the place of someone else who's been conscripted for a monetary payment. A lot of similar themes, maybe, for listeners who are familiar with some of the debates about conscription in the American Civil War, that can be traced back into the Revolutionary War as well. And so by the time you get to the end of the Revolutionary War, I won't say that you're scraping the bottom of the barrel societally, or that they're the scum of the earth or something like this, because I don't think those are helpful comments. But if you look at, say, in the Maryland line in the year 1782, how much property do these men own? Because we have records for that. Um, by and large, it's like less than 49 pounds per man of property, which is pretty vanishingly small, even in an age where people don't have a lot of money. So this is an army that, much like the tanks that the Wehrmacht uses in the Second World War. You have different tanks at the beginning of the war and the end of the war. You could very easily say, well, you have a very different American army in 1775 than you do in 1780. And in some ways, you're getting men who are a little bit more desperate for some sort of job to hold down in that army later on in the war. That's not a story that we love to tell as Americans.
For somebody who I have always seen to be a hugely passionate individual, I've never seen Alex quite as passionate as when he just tackled that question. We've clearly unlocked like a little window into a key rage that I think we need to create an entire sequence of episodes on, just to let you have that cathartic experience. But all right then, Liam, I will relinquish for now. Go on, have at it.
Well, I was going to jump into question two because, like you said, Andrew's segue was going to take us into discussing officers very nicely. However, you did mention one of your rabbit holes, so I'm gonna take your hand and jump in there with you. Um, martial race theory. Is there any links there to mercenaries? And I kind of want to throw my two pence in the ring on this. I think that because a soldier gets paid, certainly in my mind, it doesn't necessarily make them a mercenary. And maybe I'm coming at it from a more traditional sort of thought process. For me, a mercenary is someone who does it purely for money, potentially from another country, someone who travels cross border, like Alex was saying, and does it purely for financial gain. But I guess, why are people joining the army? Why are people joining the Continental Army in 1780, if not for financial gain? But so yeah, going back to martial race theory, is there any links between that and mercenaries? Andrew, do you want to jump on that?
Um, so we can start. Let's talk about the Swiss as a case, I suppose. Famous expression: "No money, no Swiss." And Swiss kind of military, the myth of the Swiss military is born in the late medieval period. You have squares of Swiss pikemen skewering Burgundian knights, and then later on, dominating battlefields across Europe. Eventually, gunpowder. Really, it's gunpowder and mass cannon. It's difficult to form a pike block when there's cannon shooting at you, and that kind of eradicates their dominance. But the myth endures, and you still have Swiss guards dotted throughout Europe. When we get to our period, the Swiss soldiers are still considered very impressive, and even just being Swiss might have people believe that, yes, you are a superior soldier. And looking at their actions, you get very different stories. It's not really borne out. Uh, at the Battle of oh God, Malplaquet, Swiss heroically get massacred charging at French positions. They're in Dutch service this time. At the Battle of Fontenoy, Swiss soldiers break and flee from Hanoverian troops and English troops advancing in column on them. So whether the myths are probably there, but I think it's just a reputational thing. If these people are mercenary, as you kind of outlined, they're looking for contracted work and they're in the service of a foreign power, and perhaps there's an element of job insecurity there. And if Alex can jump in on that, I don't imagine there being going to be fire, but perhaps there's threats of disbandment and cost cutting and things like that. I'm not sure, but the fact remains that you need to continue a martial myth to secure further employment. Whether or not that's borne out is battle dependent. But I think that a lot of it is just myth making. And I think you see the same thing in the 20th century. I think we've talked about this before, maybe not here, but maybe on a different episode, or maybe just in a pub. But how British that the British officers in the Second World War always talk about, oh, the Australians are really good in close assault, and the New Zealanders are really good in close assault, and the South Africans are really stubborn and everything like this. And it just part of that just comes across a little bit as we're willing to throw them into the harder battles, and they either win or they die. Um, and I think you could see that in the 18th century as well. The Irish develop a reputation in French service as great shock troops because they always end up covering the retreat and having to go in with the bayonet, partially because they're very poorly equipped and they end up being reasonably okay at that, but they suffer horrific casualties as a result. So, though I think it's kind of a balance between historical martial myths established long ago or in the 17th century versus martial prowess that is born of necessity that comes later on, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's a more erudite kind of response than what I would have said in terms of what you were touching on there, which is that fundamentally any kind of martial race theory is an absolutely bullshit construct, quite frankly. And I know that we have listeners who berate me for my lack of professionalism in language, but like martial race theory is a bunch of white guys deciding what attributes they're going to attach to different people from different regions. And problematic doesn't even cover it in terms of what assumptions they're making and the way in which they apply it. Like East India Company, like all they do is think about like we want people from the Himalayan regions and the hill regions, and like we're going to recruit heavily from Bengal because we're going to make assumptions about terrain and how that imbues people with certain characteristics. Like, I would say that you're absolutely right. I mean, martial race theory is made up. It's not actually a premise. It's not based on anything factually accurate. So I'm with you completely, Dorman. Sorry, Alex, I cut in before you got the chance to respond though.
No, I mean, I do think fundamentally, and certainly, I mean, the cases of the British Army is looking towards Scotland, looking towards the Indian subcontinent. I mean, these are the famous bits, but everybody in Europe does this, right? I mean, in some ways, I think it's almost like a really comforting reaction to how random and chaotic war actually is. And so, I mean, like there are martial races sort of theory within Prussia. Frederick he wants troops from Pomerania and not troops from Westphalia because he thinks the Pomeranian troops are, more solid, and the Westphalian troops drink too much wine, and they're a little bit more cowardly. And I mean, if you look across the continent as a whole at this time, there are French philosophers writing about how the Russians and the Prussians and the Swedes come from northern climes where the blood circulates less freely, and you are eating a lot of sausage and you're drinking a lot of beer, and so you're slow to recognize danger, and so as a result, these troops are braver in action. I mean, it's just insane stuff. That I would say largely comes out of human beings trying to make sense out of warfare, which is human activity that doesn't always make a lot of sense. And so it's almost like you're reaching for some sort of talisman to try and get you through this really horrible moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the British, I think Andrew makes a great point. You look at, say, the Scottish and the Irish being thrown into some really sticky situations, whether that's because they have this reputation of being great fighters or whether they are slightly more expendable, is a question that you can ask. But I think also it works the other way around. Again, I look at this from an Anglo-centric perspective, and I can sort of apologize for that. But the British Foot Guards, for example, have this reputation of being absolutely solid, but that's because of their links to the sovereign. And they have to be solid because they're the sovereign's bodyguard, and they're completely immovable. When in reality, they're, I'm probably gonna, probably be able to hear the boos from Wellington Barracks as I say this, but they're just bang average line infantry with bigger battalions. They're practically trained in the same way. They're equipped the same, but because of their links to the sovereign, they have to be seen as this immovable object.
I think nothing humbles a supposedly elite group of soldiers than a combat experience that goes slightly wrong. I mean, I don't think there is a guards battalion that I can think of in the 18th century that doesn't get a pasting at least once.
Absolutely.
And also tied up within that is perhaps an inclination to downplay if you've got a reputation, and perhaps this is something that we can kind of look at as we discuss sort of these differences, and sort of start to think about motivation. We're moving, we're basically ripping up the order of the interview, but to hell with it. Regiments certainly by Liam and my period have certain reputations. We're starting to get to that period where we're going away from numbers and into names. Um, there is this attempt to create these identities based on past exploits. Now, battalion colors are a testament to the fact that, taking pride in what your forebears have done is nothing new. But when it comes to forging that reputation, if you have a setback, well, you don't blame it on yourself. You blame it, in the case of the British during the Peninsula, you blame it on the Portuguese guys. The Portuguese ran away, and therefore we had no choice but to fall back. We stood and we took sort of 30% casualties because of the Portuguese or the Spanish or basically anybody other than us, because we are the whatever the battalion might be. We're the 1st Battalion, 40th, and we are beyond reproach. So how does that reputational aspect feed into the way in which soldiers talk about their exploits? Have we got to a point in the 18th century where people are starting to identify with, I was part of, I'm going to pluck a regiment out of the air, I don't even know if this exists, but like 1st Battalion Elba Division, like I'm sure that's not even a thing, but you can kind of get what I'm saying. um is that kind of conversation starting to happen? And if not, at what point do you start to see those conversations emerging? Because they're there and they don't come out of nowhere by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So I'm curious about where that that kind of emphasis begins to feed in, because there are these conversations about, look, we are this unit and we do not break or we do not run. So where does it come from beyond obviously like individual pride?
Yeah, so as we transition from the end of the 17th century, where you see the kind of the end of the period in which um, regiments are raised, and then immediately disbanded towards the end of the war. Now, no, maybe there are some regiments that are cut loose at the end of each conflict, but there are now permanent regiments that are increasingly being tied to the state and not just under the control of their regimental colonel, who is acting almost as like a middleman between the state and in the 17th century, the mercenary soldiers he commands. As you develop these permanent regimental traditions, you start to see um, sort of honor and reputation bound up in the uniforms, bound up in the symbols of the regiment and the flags. And the example that I'll draw from, because it's the one I looked at in my dissertation, is the Prussian 13th Regiment, which is in the period of the Seven Years' War known as the Regiment von Itzenplitz. It's known after its chef or after its colonel proprietor. It's only later in the 18th century that they get permanently assigned numbers. This unit, at the end of the war, is given the like given a position of honor in parades from the king. And so you parade in order of the founding date of the regiments. So a regiment that was founded in the 1680s would be in the front of the line. A regiment that's founded in the 1740s would be at the end of the line. But this unit is permitted to skip that distinction based upon date and parade up with the guard, because of how well they perform early in the Seven Years' War. Now, the kind of horrifying thing is once you develop a reputation like this, the king keeps reaching for you when he's in a tight spot. And so in the first few battles of the war, the Itzenplitz regiment does quite well. It goes across the Rocknitzebach with Prince Henry in 1757 at the attack at Prague. But on October 14th, 1758, during the surprise attack of the Austrians on the Prussian army at the Battle of Hochkirch, it's the regiment that the king pulls for in this moment of emergency. and these troops are sent down to essentially attack a village, and they're charging down a boulevard, the Blutgasse, and there's a whole battery of Austrian 12-pound cannon waiting for them at the end of the road. And so about 800 men are cut down in the space of about 10 minutes. And so Frederick gives the unit the distinction because of all the great stuff he did at the end of the Seven Years' War. There aren't hardly any guys left from that period when he gives them that distinction. The other thing I'll say is we can tell honor and reputation is developing at a unit level at this time because the men hear about and can be punished by the sovereign taking away distinctions. So a unit performs relatively poor. It's the 3rd Regiment, the Regiment of Anhalt-Bernburg, performs relatively poorly in the face of the enemy. And Frederick says, the king says, I want to take all of your lace off of your uniforms. I want you to give over your sidearms, your swords into regimental storage. Essentially, you've been punished for not doing very well. And the next battle, in one of this very rare moments this happening in the 18th century, this regiment, an infantry regiment, charges cavalry, and overthrows and forces to retreat a unit of Austrian cuirassiers. Frederick says, okay, all is forgiven. I'll give you your sword back. You can sew the lace back on your uniforms. The ordinary soldiers, some of them might be mercenaries, some of them might be conscripts. I mean, today, in the French Revolutionary period, we think of these conscripts as being incredibly motivated citizen soldiers, right? Today, there's a narrative that maybe conscripts don't fight as well as men who volunteer for the army. Whether they're mercenaries, whether they're conscripts, they do care about the regiments they're fighting in. They do care if the king is removing symbols of honor from these regiments, and they fight hard to try and get those back.
Dorman, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that idea of symbolism is develops as you move through the century. There's a lot of examples in the British Army we can pull from. The Scots Greys wear funny hats because of actions taken very early on, for lack of a better word or a better expression. Minden regiments, the 6 British Line battalions, thought marching a cavalry would be a good idea and somehow got away with it. They wear roses in their hats periodically. One regiment wears cross belts. I can't remember which one. Off the back of another performance. At Emsdorf, the 17th or 18th Light Dragoons go a bit mad, and then they wear Emsdorf helmets after the fact. So it's almost like one performance is all it takes, and then you can tie an identity to that. And it's interesting the transition from as mentioned in the initial question. You said that you've got a transition from numbers to names. Well, at the beginning we have names to numbers, where at the start it's the regimental officer, as Alex mentioned, who is the proprietor, and the regiments of gentlemen, which are the cavalry, I would say have a stronger sense of sort of identity. Because they are, say, the gendarme in French service, this elite bodyguard who are supposed to be the finest cavalry in all of Europe. And then some English lads walk up to them at Blenheim and pace them. And it's seen as this great humiliation. It's seen as a moment of, this is the high point of French cavalry in the 18th century or something like that. You go on these narratives. So you've got these colonel names which are assigned to the regiment. Once the regiments get numbered, then you see a bit more of maybe identity developing. But then subsequently you get a name strapped to them, but that's for recruitment purposes, more so than anything else in Britain. Whereas the French already did that with the Regiment Navarre, and they would recruit regionally. So if anything, the British Army is kind of behind the times on that front. And the French do have long traditions of these regiments, like stretching back into the 17th century. Like we fought during the 1660s. We fought for Louis XIV in his heyday. And now in the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the Regiment of Navarre deploys once more and should be considered a senior regiment. So it develops in different rates across different nationalities, I think. And I think the age of the military and the professionalization of the military plays a key role in that. And also, I guess, the homogeneity of the regiment plays a role too. And I don't just mean nationally, but rather, are they widely dispersed? Are they deployed all over the place? Are they deployed together? This kind of thing. And once you get more battalions, that becomes more complicated. Whereas it's easier in Britain when you've just got the one battalion. So develops differently across regiments. All it takes is that one moment, and then you can cling to that forever. But you'll know, I think is it the 44th foot that consistently get wiped out? Because you got Monongahela, the retreat from
Twice.
Kabul. Uh,
Uh,
is there another one as well?
well, not really, but you're right. Mahongahela and Retreat from Kabul are the two.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, I mean, it's the sort of the one battalion at the time in, what was that, 1758? No, I can't remember. And,
yeah,
yeah, 1840. But I think it is well known that they are one of the only British battalions to be sort of pretty much de-existed twice.
yeah. But I don't think it's well known, but I don't think they're going to cling to that too much.
No,
Yeah.
no,
So
absolutely not.
I think that plays a role as well. It's how you frame your defeat, is also quite important. You can make a glorious last stand, but is it a last stand that's worthy of commemoration in a regimental capacity versus in a kind of heroic painting capacity is also worth unpicking.
I mean, I think from a sort of cultural point of view, and again, I'm looking at this from a British Army point of view. I think they can be viewed with as much kind of motivation for the descendants as the sort of the big battle honors and the the big clear victories. Certainly for you take the 44th for example, the retreat from Kabul resonates right the way through into the Essex Regiment and into the Royal Anglians today. So it's not like celebrated like as a regimental day, for
Yeah.
instance, like Salamanca Day, but it certainly does play into the unit's identity, at least from a sort of non-tangible point of view.
Yeah. And identity's layered,
Mm.
and there's a lot of factors to consider there, but I think that it's worth mentioning at least, if nothing else.
So at this point, we are going to abandon the advertised schedule uh, for this episode. Welcome to the Napoleonic Wars. Like this is becoming a bad joke on this show at this point in the way in which we plan an interview, and it's something that's become much worse. I find since I've recruited other people to the show. And it's not Liam's fault because Liam's the one who keeps messaging me going, "Can you please stick to the damn script?" But we're gonna park officers, I think, and instead we're gonna sort of focus that bit more on rank and file because that's really that this meets with a lot of approval from Alex. So clearly I've made the right judgment call. I will pretend that I have read the room. So after much perusal and discussion with my learned colleagues, uh, that you definitely didn't just hear, listeners, we're going to focus on rank and file, and I want to talk about who these people actually are. Where do they come from? Whether that's geographically, but perhaps more interestingly, where from within society are these people drawn from? Everybody loves to talk about the scum of the earth thing from Wellington, and we've done to death the fact that that is absolute nonsense and it's a demonstration of Wellington's own prejudices. But I'm going to put another question in this. Why do people sign up, first of all? Is it as simple as people need money? And do you see what we certainly see during the Napoleonic era of people sign up to the army when all of the laboring jobs are used up? And that tells us, or when there is sort of hardship when it comes to things like harvests. And so, therefore, this tells us that predominantly the army is staffed by a laboring class. Does that track back into your period? But more broadly, who are these people who sign up? Wellington always talking about sort of pickings of prisons and all the rest of it. Are those facilities there in earlier periods, or in an era where you're not desperate for armies of quite the same size? Are people able to be that little bit more choosy about who and where they recruit from? Andy, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah. Okay. There's kind of two ways we can go about this. We can talk about recruitment standards, or we can talk about the individuals who circumvented them. Um,
Let's start with recruitment standards then, and then deal with the circumvention. How about
yeah. So there were in the British case, you have certain expectations, chiefly among which that you are of a certain height, a certain age, and a certain religion. Would be the three big ones, I would say. Height restrictions fluctuate throughout the century. In wartime, they go down, and in peacetime, they go up. And some of my favorite passages from regimental returns are how they always put the short guys in the back so the regiment looks taller when they're being observed by the officers. So they would fluctuate. I think 5'5", 5'6" is kind of standard, and then in wartime it might drop a bit. Cavalry might be a little bit taller. Again, it's different. In terms of age, from what I've seen, the British Army targets people in their early to mid 20s. And it's not really the era of the teenage soldier, which was surprising to me when I was looking through these regimental returns. That most of them are in their 20s and they've only been serving for a couple of years. So mathematically, you know, they have to be recruited in their 20s. Uh, and then in terms of religion, there's a reluctance to recruit Catholics into British service for a lot of the century for fears of papal uprising and the evils of popery and all this jazz. But the reality is, look, a Catholic can carry a musket as well as a Protestant, or a Methodist, who also feature later on. And if the recruiting sergeant is a little bit unscrupulous, he'll happily turn a blind eye. It's not that they weren't allowed to recruit Catholics, but they had to sign an oath to the king, and by extension, Catholics couldn't do that because of having to swear fealty to God and papacy, etc. So that's kind of it was believed to be exclusionary, whereas if the Catholic kind of crossed his fingers and muttered or coughed at a certain point, perhaps they found a way around it. So there were standards in place, but how closely they were adhered to depended on the wider context. Does the regiment need a lot of men very quickly? Well, we can let some things slide. Is the regiment about to ship out to the West Indies? Well, then let's just get everyone in and go. Or perhaps, hey, other regiments, do you want to send us your dullards, and then we'll head out to the West Indies? Also features too. So yeah, in theory there were laws in place to make sure the army was of a certain quality, but in practice, the realities of just military life made it a bit more of a mixed bag.
It's
And
very
a lot of them were
telling.
called John. Like a really high percentage of them were called John.
First name or surname?
First
I've
name.
got okay, because I'm my immediate thing there is are people kind of I'm skeptical at the idea that John is like the most popular name
Oh, it's
in
like a
the
Tommy
18th.
Atkins sort of situation.
Yeah, are people basically sort of going, "What's your name, son?" And sort of the guy sort of mutters something, and either they go, "Well, I don't know how to spell that, so therefore I'm going to be sort of terribly British about this, and I'm going to call you John." You can sort of imagine an officer going, "Hey, well, no, that sort of name won't do. We're going to call you John. That's a good British name, a good English name that we approve of. Yes, that's the right sort of thing." You can imagine some kind of thing like that happening, maybe. Or are
Mm.
people kind of not wanting to actually state their real names? Is there some kind of subversion going on there? And I can't quite work out whether that would be I'm trying to run away from something and therefore I'm going to give my wrong name in order to hide in this regiment. Or is there a kind of a protest of, you want my name, I don't want to give you my name, so we're going to go with John because it's a generic name. A bit like sort of turning around and going, "Who are you? I'm Bob," because I don't want to. How can we help you, Bob? Kind of. Do you know what I mean? There's maybe I'm reading too much into that, but Liam's looking at me going, "You are absolutely reading far too much into that. Like, you need to calm down." But these are the kind of neurons that are firing in my head, and I'm in a phase with my own research where I'm just like, let's see where those neurons go.
Mm.
So I'm looking to you guys to pull me back down to earth and basically tell me that I'm an idiot.
Can I fuel a conspiracy theory fire with a conspiracy theory of my own instead?
Do it.
Okay, so my one of the things I'm putting in my book, so preview for everyone at home, which I'm sure they'll definitely buy, is that the military deliberately hid the number of Irish soldiers in the ranks and did so en masse. And the evidence I have for this are from the desertion reports that they published in newspapers, where they would list where the recruit was alleged to be from and then where he was actually from. So the fact that the army kept that information of where he was actually from suggests that they were more than willing to push things under the door and conceal things until it was administratively convenient to reveal that information. It's like, oh, by the way, look, he says he's Welsh, but actually he's got an Irish accent. So maybe you're onto something, but I don't know.
Liam, I need you to schedule an episode on desertion immediately. We won't go deep into that rabbit hole, but like we need to talk more. I am interested in that. Alex, are you going to sort of sluice cold water over our
Yeah, absolutely.
our
Let's bring it back down to earth and out of their own conspiracy theories. Who were 18th century soldiers? Well, I mean, if you ask someone like Don Hegest, he would say it's an inane question because 18th century soldiers were millions of people, and you have to get to know them on an individual level. And you can't really talk about them as class, but that's no fun. So let's do that. So what are they like socially? What can we can tell, if we can tell anything from recruiting records and inspection returns, things like this. Depending on what army you take, say we take the Austrian army, 30% of recruits in the Austrian army have engaged in some sort of specialized trade other than being an agricultural laborer before they were in the army. If in the British army, that goes as high as 45%. And indeed, depending on what year you take and what returns you look at, something between 20 and 40% of the British army during the War of Independence were out of work textile workers of some stripe or another. Now, by and large, these men are coming from the rural world. They're coming from the world of agricultural labor. Indeed, in the Prussian army, there are whole classes of people who are excluded from conscription, basically to ensure that we're drawing on agricultural laborers and not people like clergymen, officials, landowners, the heads of households, only sons of widows, people who have actually mastered a trade. Cooks are forbidden from being conscripted. So there are the army self-selects towards people maybe on the poorer end of the spectrum in terms of conscription in the case of Prussia. But with that said, what does it mean to be the scum of the earth? Jokingly, the president of the United States has just called all adherents of one political party garbage. Is that kind of the same level of comment as Wellington is making here, as he's saying they're the scum of the earth? I mean, they're agricultural laborers, so they're mostly illiterate. I mean, depending on what year and what country you're talking about. In a country like Prussia, probably 40% of the country can read. Probably 40% of the army can't read. So by and large, you're skewing rural in these military units. You're skewing uneducated in these military units. That doesn't necessarily mean that all these folks are the scum of the earth, right? And even back in this period where there's not the depending on your perspective, wonderful force of nationalism drawing everyone to the colors, it doesn't mean that they're the scum of the earth here in the 18th century either. There are a lot of weavers and tailors and shoemakers in the British army, in the Prussian army, in the Austrian army. Sometimes the army, much as it is today for some folks, is a pathway to a better life. In the Russian army in the period of the Great Northern War, Peter the Great has to repeatedly turn away peasant volunteers for the army because they're looking to ascend the social ladder in the military. They're looking to get out of their local communities into a profession which perhaps will be a bit more stable than the impoverished local rural communities that they're coming from. So depending on where we are in Europe, depending on who we're talking about, the army skews relatively poor. The army skews relatively uneducated. That doesn't necessarily mean these folks are the scum of the earth. Why are they enlisting? I mean, you could ask that question today, and I'll take it from the American case. And I know it's mostly a UK pod. I don't know if you all have a ton of fringe benefits, like we call the GI Bill. You can go get an education when you're retired from the military because you served in the armed forces. We have that here in the States. Um, why do people enlist in the military in America today? Do they do it because they really love America, or do they do it because they want to go to college for free? I mean, these are different questions, and maybe a different person might answer that question at different times in different places. I think probably the same would be equally true in the 18th century. But I would warn us against the idea that they're all just signed up because they're looking for 3 square meals a day. I mean, you look at the writing of a man like John Robert Shaw, who enlists in the 33rd to go fight the Americans in the War of Independence. He says at a very young age, he's still a teenager, I banished all thoughts of domestic concerns and fixed my mind firmly on the resolution of enlisting as a king's soldier. Um, this same type of comment you see about guys who are conscripted into the Prussian army. Robert Jackson, who's a surgeon in the 71st Regiment of Foot, does a tour of Prussia. And he writes kind of in his diary talking about native Prussians. Um, how can we explain how well the Prussian army performs in the 18th century if it's all just they're afraid of their officers and getting beaten all the time with canes? He says, quote, heroic acts do not originate in fear. Yet the Prussian soldiers were often heroic. The native Prussian, irritated and inflamed against the invader of his country, here he gives a parenthetical statement, for the peasant venerates the soil which protects the ashes of his fathers, became ardent in defense. The old soldier was proud of his regiment's renown. The recruit, whether forced or not, carried away in the torrent, he imbibed a sensation of glory from anticipated success and became proud of himself. So there's a mix of patriotic devotion, man, I'm looking to make a better life for myself. Man, I really just need a job. All of these things are kind of coming together across the armies of military Europe, motivating young men from the peasant class to go and serve in these militaries.
Can I ask what sounds like a slightly facetious question? Yeah, sorry, Liam. You're used to it by now, mate. Because one of the words that we've touched on fleetingly, both in the introduction and elsewhere, is lace. And so this is why it sounds facetious. Is it about lace? But actually, there is a deeper question there about what historians would probably term military spectacle, about the imagery of people in uniform, the appeal, the sort of masculine identities that sort of get woven into ideas of military service. You want to go and see the world, you want to go and fight, you want to go and defend, you want to go and do these things that society has always kind of preconditioned men to aspire to. And lace can, the military uniform, for one read the other during this period, can be an example of that. How much of that feeds into this?
How much do the sort of the shiny uniforms
Yeah,
attract
yeah, yeah,
seeing the recruiting sergeant? Is it the inducement of drink, or the fact that wow, he cuts a nice figure in his uniform? Is that what
precisely.
brings the men into service? Yeah, I mean certainly, especially in armies that allow the men to, after a year of wear, possess their own clothing. I mean this is a nice material benefit. Um, but I mean, people like John Robert Shaw, um, some of the Prussian soldiers that I've encountered. I mean, the air of being a soldier, of being as a result of the organization of militaries by the end of the 17th century, of wearing these uniforms, whether they're laced or not, um, the military bearing that you take on, the way you're supposed to wear your hat in a military context. Usually, when you see reenactors or people in films wearing an 18th century cocked hat, they're wearing it kind of straight on their head. And if you look at a lot of sketches of soldiers from the 18th century, particularly in Britain, the men are wearing it at a really like jaunty angle. They're trying to look sexy as they're on duty. And so all of this stuff kind of I imagine there's this perception in the UK as well as there is in the United States today. Ladies like a man in uniform. There's something dangerous and exciting about being in the military. These things are as true in the 18th century, I think, as they are today. I mean, there are a number of British young men who I looked at in my dissertation, who maybe have gotten into a bit of trouble at home, and they join the military as a way of putting their life on a different track. And that might sound like it's a sort of scum of the earth sort of thing to do. You get a girl pregnant, you hop into the 41st Regiment, and you go to India. Surprisingly, where I encounter these men is they're writing letters back to their family, essentially trying to say, like, man, we'd like to, I know I messed up a bit. I'd like to be forgiven. I'd like to come home and rejoin my local community. And so in some ways, if you're in a tight spot, the Army can maybe add a little bit of respectability to your life that can maybe kind of help facilitate, both get you out of and get you back into your local community. Yeah, it's what makes people enlist. Yeah, certainly I do think is the sharpness of these military uniforms. And the 18th century is a world that prioritizes a lot of form. I would argue it's not form without function, but looking good in a military uniform is something that these soldiers and their officers do prize. And that's absolutely a part of the story.
I want to look. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to observe that point about prizing uniforms. They're quite quick to cast them off on campaign if needed, though.
Yeah, what do you mean cast them off? Are you
Well,
talking about cutting
modify.
their hair and cutting
Yeah,
down the hats and
yeah, there's
yeah,
a
sure,
practical element to it.
absolutely. I mean, they're doing this in America. I think when you look at what the troops are actually wearing on campaign versus what they're wearing on the parade ground, it's as different in the 18th century as it is today,
Yeah,
right? I mean, if you read Hale's description of the grenadiers going into action at Brandywine, they're not wearing their big, grenadier caps until they actually go into action, right? I mean, they don't want to get them dirty until it's absolutely necessary. So there's a lot of adaptability. In the case of the Prussian army, in the case of the British army, in the case of some of the Hessian services, most of the time when you're on fatigue duty, when you're chopping wood, which is really the majority of 18th century life. I mean, a lot of these guys think the military is going to be this incredibly, exciting and dangerous and, that time that's going to be, smashing. They're out there cutting cords of wood to, ensure that the frontier post they're garrisoning doesn't freeze during the winter. You're wearing your old uniform from 2 or 3 years ago. And so the form and the function of military life, a lot of these uniforms are surprisingly practical, especially as we're in a northern climate like Europe. You're still in the mini ice age, right? And so it's a bit colder. When I'm in America in my regulars uniform for the 8th Foot, all the people coming to the reenactment say, "What on earth are you wearing all that wool for?" It made a bit more sense, say, if you were in York in 1750 to have a wool jacket on than it does in 2024.
Liam, I mean, you love a discussion about the practicalities of soldier clothing, and I'm also very conscious that I've seen you either in that dashing red coat, but I've also seen you in your, I don't know what you'd term it, but sort of like I'm not in the line right now, I'm in camp, and I'm wearing sort of this white jacket with the same yellow facings, but it's a different bit of kit. So I'm curious about your perspective on this.
I mean, I'd agree that I think that the uniform, certainly by post 1812, it is developed to a point where it is very, very functional, and each sort of thing has its place. The forage coats sort of come from a waistcoat, a foraging waistcoat that you see sort of phased out towards the end of the 18th century. But I think the most important thing, the adaptations you see, I think, in the 18th century are linked to tactical circumstance, as opposed to we're just going to start cutting bits off because there's no reason to do it. I don't want to sort of labor the North American point of, the British Army in North America. And it comes out a different army to what it comes in, because I think those lessons are probably forgotten for a little bit and then re-remembered, and all the rest of it. But it's very practical in order to change your hat, change the way that you use certain equipment, the development of the light infantry tactics, I think leads to a lot of that equipment change. But I don't think it would necessarily stick anywhere else, at any given time, if that makes sense.
I guess I mean, I don't want to make this a discipline conversation, but there is a discipline facet to what Dorman's raising here as well, right? Because regulations state that you need to have a certain standard of attire. And once you start jettisoning bits of kit, we're not trying to perpetuate the sharp stocks, leather stocks being hated by all men myth. I mean, hell, even I've spent a little bit of time wearing a leather stock. Like, it's not that bad.
And they're
But
mostly wearing cloth rollers in the 18th century. But yeah, yeah.
okay, so different problems. But like, there is this point that if you start jettisoning things, obviously, I mean, this is where my arguments about pragmatism come in, right? Like, what is necessary in order to make life easier and prioritize what needs to be prioritized on campaign versus the letter of the regulation, and there's a yawning chasm between the two. But Dorman, I'm curious about sort of your reactions to all of that, and how I guess the navigation of the discipline element within that, and also what we've just been discussing here.
Yeah, the the idea of the man in uniform as a sex object definitely features in the 18th century. You have, I think it's a Highland regiment use it as a recruitment tool. So the women in Ulster love a man in uniform, and some officers comment on that as well. So it definitely features. The idea of discipline, though, is really interesting because one of the more serious infractions, but it's also quite a common infraction you see is soldiers who are on garrison using their uniform as a gambling like, token because it's something they have, and they will gamble away their uniform. And I think it's Roger Lamb, maybe, or Corporal Todd. I can't remember which of the two. They write about. I don't know how they got away with it because he's standing in line without his coat, and the officer either ignores it or doesn't see it. But somehow this fella manages to get away with this. And I see it if we look at the punishment books as well, gambling away items of clothing or selling them is really common. So whilst there's certainly an attachment, it is also an item which can be considered, at least to a limited extent, property of the individual, and they do have a bit of individual autonomy, and they do with what they will. Punishment be damned, and they do get punished for it, but they're still willing to make that. Now, whether or not they're selling it because they need to feed an alcohol habit or a gambling habit or what have you, fact remains there's still that little bit of individuality going on there, even if it does result in flogging. You know,
I
say like
think a
air.
lot of these, I think a lot of these adaptations, when you look at it from a discipline point of view, they are led by local commanders, whether that be regimental commanders or NCOs within the particular unit. They are deciding as a unit that actually what works for us in our role right now is to do X, and it's then passed around the chain of command in a sort of mutual way that, well, we're going to do this because it works. And then the commanding officer goes, yeah, cool, no worries. And he passes it up to brigade, and it's kind of, well, we're doing this. So it's not like the guys are going rogue and, cutting bits off. It's generally, it's local standing orders as opposed to army regulations. I think that's really a really important point to consider.
Mhm.
And there's also a lot of top-down flexibility as well. I mean, the troops that are in the Caribbean are all wearing linen as opposed to wool, right? Except for their uniform jackets. Even in Northern Europe and America, you have like different clothing issues in different part of the year. I mean, the Germans call it the Klein and the Grossmundierung. So in the summer, you get the small issue, which is linen pants and a linen vest. It's not as hot, and when you get ready to get into winter, you get wool breeches and a wool vest. Now, the it if you've worn 18th century clothing, it's a little bit more restrictive than, wearing a t-shirt in the 21st century. But civilian clothing is a little bit more restrictive than wearing a t-shirt in the 20th century as well. To a large extent in the 18th century, the cut and the style of military clothing is kind of keeping pace with civilian fashion. And I mean, these are functional garments that are designed to be worn in multiple ways. I mean, the British Army and the Prussian Army, you can wear your uniform coat with the lapels that have all the fancy lace on them buttoned down so you can see all the lace. In wintertime, the standard regulation is you wear it buttoned over, so all the lace is hidden, but the coat's a lot warmer. So I mean, there are different ways, even before you get to cutting things off of the uniform or styling your hair differently in North America. There are a lot of things you can do to make the clothing that you're wearing more effective and adaptable than the regulations or just looking at a photograph of reenactors might seem to indicate.
I've just had a message from Liam via the management, basically going, "We need a uniforms episode. Like, can we make it?" Alex is very enthused by that point. So there's your answer, Liam. Yes, we shall have a uniforms episode just for you. Well, just for you and Alex. But I'm sure we can factor discussions of lace in there somewhere. But one of the things that I do want to just focus on as we sort of begin to wrap up what we've been talking about over the course of this and tie some of these ideas together is that question of respectability. We've talked about different stratas of society perhaps being particularly drawn upon. We've talked about notions of scum of the earth. We've talked about questions of divides. We've talked about reputations of soldiers and quite why people recruit, and are they sex symbols or are they not? How reputable is a career in the army, and what variations are there in that? I'm not going to ask, do we see variations? Because of course we see variations. That's kind of a given if people are familiar with the nature of society during this period. But what are those distinctions? But whether it be between officer and rank and file, and I guess across different nations.
Sure. So, I mean, again, I think it does depend on the nation. If you look at, say, America first, the folks who serve in the Revolutionary Army actually don't get a whole lot. I mean, there's some land bounties they get out in the West after we fought the Northwest Indian War during Washington's administration. But it's actually a bit later that they end up coming back and saying, we'll give pensions out to Revolutionary War veterans. So we're behind you all in terms of, say, the pensioners and Chelsea and things like this. In Prussia, I actually did a lot of work on this because I thought it was going to turn into a chapter, and I ended up not writing this chapter. But military service is a way to become a head of household if you're a younger son, or if you don't stand much of a chance to inherit in your local community. If you're a cantonist, and so the Prussian army, much of it in the 18th century is almost like the Army Reserve in America today. So you're with the colors for maybe a month out of the year, and then you're furloughed home, you're working a civilian trade for about 11 months out of the year. And so the men who are drafted or conscripted into the army and are cantonists like this, they all send petitions to the king saying, I'd like to get married and I'd like to build a house for myself in my local community. I served and continue to serve you faithfully in the military. Will you let me become a head of household and you'll marry my girlfriend? And by and large, the response to these is positive. So especially for these Prussian men, military service they didn't choose, they were conscripted, is a way of gaining advancement in their local communities. There are certainly echelons of society where men in uniform are not viewed very positively. William Archenhold Sousa, Prussian, he takes a tour of Britain in 1782. He looks at the culture there, and he says, "Wow, it's kind of rough. I mean, soldiers aren't allowed in all inns and taverns. There are places that soldiers can go and can't go. So are soldiers in the highest echelons of society as a result of their military service? Probably not, especially not common soldiers. Um, are in some states is military service viewed more positively as a way of social advancement? Absolutely. In some states like Russia, it's essentially viewed as a death sentence, and the peasants, when you're conscripted, actually have like a mock funeral for you as you're leaving the village because they know they're never going to see you again. And so if you survive in the Russian military for 25 years, you've sort of made it in life, and you maybe you can go back to your old village community, maybe not. Um, so yeah, I obviously it varies, and to some extent, this sense of honor, the Prussian king is not stamping a lot of these petitions to build a house for yourself, if you're deserting from the military, or if you've got a disciplinary record that's a mile long. But if you serve well, if you are keep your nose clean while you're in uniform, then there's a much greater chance, even in this pre-revolutionary world, that society might view military service as not kind of a thing that to be recoiled from in horror, as the 18th century wears on, but instead perhaps a trade like any other. Or if you're, in a relatively militarized country like Prussia, maybe this is viewed as being a slightly more positive thing.
So earlier in the episode, we talked about masculinity and we talked about individuality. I think those are both two really important points to tease out. The service in an army is inherently servile
Hmm.
by its very nature. And there were a lot of popular opinions of soldiers that they were more juvenile as a result, that they could not progress as men. Marriage was discouraged. You could still get away with it, possibly, but it was slightly frowned upon. Um, you have to wear a specific uniform, so there's no real expression of individuality there. But despite this, soldiers found other ways. So you've mentioned writing. They Grand Tour proxy narratives that they write when they're on. Like when you look at a soldier's diary, you compare it to a Grand Tour diary, they're very similar. And junior officers in particular will kind of write in the same way. Even if they're just looking at a bog, they'll somehow make it the most beautiful bog they've ever seen. Um, so that side of things, for sure, there's like a proxy element to it. Karen Harvey has this great idea that legs were the centerpiece of masculinity, which is why soldiers wore tight trousers, which I like that famous painting of Bannister Tarleton. I don't know if you subscribe to that or not. It's a different thing, but it's an interesting idea that the uniform itself was accentuated the masculine features of the soldiers themselves.
Can I just say, Marshall Murat enters the chat at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Like how flamboyant can you get? Um, but the idea that soldiers lost their sense of individuality by be it flogging or they were turned into automata through drill, etc., it's not really true. And when you look at disciplinary infractions and the way when soldiers mutiny, it's usually because they haven't been, paid properly, and then it's a workplace dispute. It's not because they value themselves as laborers and they recognize that the military they're serving values their service as laborers. It's not a necessarily rebelling against authority. It's they demand recognition for what they're doing. And when you look at officer wives, for example, they petition for pensions in much the same way that Alex was describing soldiers requesting houses. Like their wives and families will often petition the government for what they feel is due to them after their service. So there's a familial element to that as well. That's worth considering. And the way soldiers are cared for after, if they get wounded, do they go to Chelsea, Kilmainham, Les Invalides, etc. So I think if there is a takeaway, and we talked a lot about the rank and file and everything like that, it's not this faceless mass of people. It appears that way because none of the records survived from these people, but it isn't a faceless mass. This is hundreds of thousands of individuals with their own stories, who have their own problems, maybe they are, they're so suffering with alcoholism, so they gamble away their uniform to fund that. This sort of thing. They all have their own story to tell. We have a limited access to them, but okay, the officers are easier to see, but it's the rank and file, I think. It's important not to lose sight of that individuality. And they worried about looking manly as much as people might do today. And obviously standards change, but people still want to be liked or perceived as a good person.
By and large, I completely agree. I think there's a lot of flexibility with your uniform when you're off duty. And there are a lot of textual descriptions of soldiers who are kind of will wear their uniform in different ways and match it up with other civilian garments when they're not actually serving. There are great descriptions. I want to say it's either the Comte de Mirabeau or the Comte de Guibert who tours Berlin in the 1780s and is kind of scandalized. Soldiers are like half naked and they're working like jobs in the city. So I think today we view the military as being something. It's when you're in the army, unless you're in the Army Reserve, it's your kind of your full-time job. The I am skeptical of the idea that in the 18th century, the military identity fully penetrates the individual quite as much. Because say in Prussia, you're still working a civilian trade alongside your job, even if you're one of these mercenaries. You're only on duty in peacetime 3 or 4 days a week, and the other days you go off doing whatever you want. And usually that's not gambling and whoring. Usually it's like, I got to have a job to make some money so I can, sort of facilitate my alcoholism or, whatever it might be. And so one of the major narratives that we have in society today about the military is the tight nature of control. And you see this in all the scenes with the drill sergeants in films. There's a lot of that in the 18th century, especially when the troops are on duty. And maybe we'll have a whole episode on discipline. I know that would certainly make you happy, Zach. But when you're off duty, there's a really shocking amount of freedom, especially in a world where most soldiers aren't living in barracks. They're living sort of out on the town or quartered with the civilian population. So there's a ton of interpenetration between the civilian world and the military world in a way that kind of goes away after nationalism, after the French Revolutionary Wars. And so in that way, I do think we are kind of in separated today from the 18th century by these developments that are so key to the pod.
Well, on that note, and I think that's a really good way to wrap it there. Thank
God
you
damn it,
very
Liam.
much.
I've got like 50 rabbit holes that I could open up just from that final comment. But yeah, you're all right. Yes, I shall concede the mic this time.
I mean, to be fair, I could go back and readdress some of the uniform stuff and we'd be here till tomorrow. But I certainly think we're opening up more opportunities to have future episodes with these guys, which is great for us. Thank you very much, Alex and Andrew. Dr. Alexander Burns, Assistant Professor of History at Franciscan University of Steubenville. We're all looking forward to his next book, Infantry and Battle, 1733 to 1783, and hopefully that will appear from Hellion soon. And Dr. Andrew Dorman, also very much looking forward to his book that will be published as part of the Boydell and Brewer's Irish Historical Monograph series, and hopefully we'll see that sometime in 2025. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for listening. And as always, the Napoleonic Wars podcast will be back very soon.
Hello again, folks. As the festive season approaches, why not spread the festive cheer in one of a few ways? Firstly, reviews. Most of you probably listen to this when you're in the car, so can't do anything when you hear our pleas to leave a review. If you're listening to this at home during the festive season, though, there's a chance that you can reach straight for your phone. So head to Apple Podcasts, leave a review and a comment. It costs you nothing. But if every single one of the 2,000 people tuning in each week did it, we'd be one of the top-rated shows in Europe. Please, if you appreciate the free content, give us 30 seconds in exchange for the hundreds of hours of material we give you. Looking for a Christmas gift? Got Christmas money to burn? Head over to the Napoleonic Wars Pod shop on Printify, we'll put a link below, and get your hands on the Now Napoleon Assists, Now's Your Time mug, the Secretary at Home t-shirts, and a host of other merch. Want a personalized hoodie? We can provide that. Get in touch with us at napwarspod@gmail.com. You have a Napoleon assist in your life? Are they gagging for access to our socials, our online course, or exclusive behind-the-scenes access to our interviews? Well, you can now gift a Patreon membership to the show. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars Pod to find out more. Prices start from £2 a month, and excitingly, we are doing a Patreon giveaway. Anyone who is a member of our Exploring Officers, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admirals tiers on Patreon on the 21st of December 2024 will automatically be entered into a prize draw. The winning 3 will be given free access to the full Legion to Scholar experience for the month of January, from the online course to the behind-the-scenes access to interviews and the Meet the Author experience. To enter, just be signed up as an Exploring Officer, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admiral Patron by the 21st of December 2024, and if you win, we'll let you know in time for Christmas. Shout outs to all of our patrons. In the Mentioned in Dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Ruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, the enigmatically named Zed, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion to Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Merry Christmas, my friends. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves. Have a great festive break. Stay well, enjoy the mulled wine, and as always, thank you for listening.